Good stuff. Well, we're live.
Thank you. I was too ambitious on the amount of slides I had.
Always.
Right. Hi guys. So I guess we're going to be talking about network effects of game engines, but we should probably talk about network effects of on-chain games as well before before we talk about the network effects of the game engines. So it was a great talk, Justin. Maybe the first thing I'd like to start with is from a player point of view, from the point of view of somebody who's playing games, what kind of dynamics, what kind of network dynamics have you observed already with the on-chain games that you've built? Like network effects that are different from Web 2 games versus mobile games, stuff like this. Because Dark Forest, Dope Wars, I don't know, roll your own, right?
Mm-hmm. Sweet. I'll give just a brief introduction on myself. You guys obviously just heard from Justin, so know him. I'm Terrence. I'm the co-founder of Cartridge. We've been building on-chain games, tooling, infrastructure for the past 2 years, and one of those contributions to the ecosystem is Dojo, which is a provable game engine, and it's very similar to what Justin just described in a lot of aspects, and powers a few of the teams building fully on-chain games today. I think, for these ideas of these fully open, extensible, composable worlds, like network effects are obviously incredibly important, and we've seen that play out practically, I would say, to a significant extent in the Realms ecosystem, which is based on the Loot ecosystem, where essentially it's this open IP. If you're not familiar with Loot, it's like Dungeons and Dragons kind of on-chain that was released a few years ago, and Realms has their organization has really pushed into this fully on-chain space. And there's a lot of different teams, despite being like a relatively underfunded organization. They have like hundreds of thousands of dollars inside of their DAO treasury. They have a lot of very passionate members of the community that spend their weekends and nights building out this community in a bunch of different dimensions. And I think today they have like maybe 20 different games that they're building inside of the Realms IP, including things like Loot Survivor that was just deployed to mainnet. And I think those kind of network effects are not really possible without this foundational, credible commitment to being an open ecosystem that people can build on top of and collaborate. So I think to that extent, yeah, very important.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I find interesting is thinking about this from the perspective of like what's the surface area of interaction people have out of the box, right? And one thing that is interesting is like there's this speciation that not speciation, but there's this like specialization that happens where you have these groups of players. There's like a hefty amount of them that are like speculators, because that's like most of what you get in like the gaming space in crypto. But then you have like some like curious developers. You have some people that are genuinely interested about these new types of games, and they will kind of like almost automatically organize based on what they do best, because all of them have enough surface area to play with without having the developers come in and actually build this for you. So here's an example. If you build a game with Mud or Dojo, you deploy it, immediately, like the developer crowd can come in and we'll be able to see like, oh, this is the code that's running, these are the APIs. We know the standard tooling. That's a nice thing. I guess that's one of the network effect of these game engines, is if people know the tooling, they can kind of like build on top of any of these games. They know the tooling, so they can start like, the first thing they usually use, they build leaderboards, or they build like analytics. Like, oh, there's no analytics for like, what's the best letter to play in this Scrabble game? I'm gonna build like some analytics on top. The speculator crowd comes in and they really try to figure out what's the thing I can own here and how do I get it? And so they're just gonna automatically create this, like, if you think about like incentives and like why people do things as a space that is first flat at the beginning, that gets curved by incentives and people there, that like almost like curve this space. These investors come in and start curving the space. They're like, well, there's this like, I don't know, golden carrot, and I really want it, so I'm just gonna like offer some cash for this, and this is automatically gonna create like these interactions between the players and the developers to just make more of these carrots. And if you've built kind of like your sinks and your faucets in a way that makes sense, this will like start getting like a flow to happen in the system. So that's like another thing that's interesting, is like these investors types can come in and the surface area for them to play with is already there. You don't really have to build it. And from a player perspective, I think having talked to a bunch of them, people that are non-technical, they don't really care about the money, one of the things that like really gets them interested is this feeling of like, we're not just like logging in on Steam and playing the game and then talking about it, and we're limited by like there's this client and everything on the other side is hidden. They see behind the door a lot of the time, right? Because there's like all of this activity that happens, and it's hard to explain here on this panel just by like saying some random words, but like there's this feeling of like there's something going on that is much stronger than if you were, it's like the theme park versus the bazaar, right? Like when you're at the theme park, everybody's like so well done and you're not kind of like seeing what's on the other side, but here there's a bazaar and you see the activity even if there's a few players, and for a specific type of players it's really exciting. And I do think that the ability to get this out of the box from day one is really powerful. Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting. Like, what type of player would you say that it is for whom it is exciting?
Yeah. I'd say a lot of people are really into like obscure internet stuff. Like the internet used to be way less polished. I mean, it still is the case right now, but you have to go a little bit more underground. And in this unpolished internet phase, of like Tumblr and like SCP and like the Reddit era and all of that, there is a specific kind of people that like the chaos and things being created and them being able to participate. And I think we switched into an internet that is way more theme park-like, where all of the surface area is super polished. And I think a lot of people are looking for this, and that stuff kind of like gets created in these environments. Yeah.
So it sounds like it's creators. So basically, people who have that like creative
or
instinct,
spectators.
Right.
Like some people just like to see that stuff
Watch it,
happening
yeah, yeah.
because like, oh, it's really interesting, right?
Is that why you guys have moved? I mean, we are talking about games, right? But both of you're building Mud, you're building Dojo, you're building these engines. Is that the reason that you've sort of decided to build the end? Well, what's the reason that you guys are that you're building Mud now instead of like, just improving Dark Forest or something like that, and you're working on Dojo rather than just improving Dope Wars? What's the reason for that?
I think to a lot, so Dojo is a culmination of like a bunch of experience that we had building on-chain games that in the Dope Wars ecosystem initially, like you mentioned. I think there's a lot of components about developing on the blockchain that take some level of domain knowledge, and there's a lot of sharp edges around it in doing it correctly. And we're building content internally. So we started 2 years ago building this game, Roll Your Own, with a fully on-chain game engine called RYO, which is obviously the acronym of Roll Your Own. It was modular by design, built on top of Starknet, and it was like really intellectually interesting. And I think like an interesting antidote to what you mentioned, like when we started Dope Wars 2 years ago, it was spawned from an NFT token that was like free to mint and got a bunch of people into the ecosystem, and there was a lot of energy around it. It was like 2017, and so many people seemed to care about like the Dope Boys ecosystem. But it very quickly became apparent that they really just cared about the price of the NFT increasing. And so, like we took this kind of detour into building fully on-chain games. I was introduced to it by a friend of mine called Parama, who came to the DAO and was like, hey, like there's this really new interesting technology what Starknet is building, and I want to build a fully on-chain game on top of it. And to a lot of the people in the ecosystem, they were not excited about this, and it led to, I kind of checked out for a little while because people were like, yeah, no, but like we should be like, providing liquidity on Uniswap. We shouldn't be building an on-chain game. Like, what the fuck is an on-chain game? Like, how does it pump my token so I can sell it tomorrow? In the interim, there's been like obviously a lot of those participants has exited, and now these ecosystems have more sincere like kind of people that are intellectually curious about exploring them and more productive contributions to this idea. So there's definitely two different types of network effects, and you want to make sure that you build them up from a strong base of people that are sincerely involved. And I think what you mentioned is the on-chain games and autonomous worlds have the ability to create meaning for participants. So you can create networks of strong people that want to contribute and participate in these without necessarily having like the hyper-financialized component right off the bat. So that was just a little bit of a detour there, but to answer your question more specifically, there's a lot of, I think like one of the great innovations of MUD was just standardizing how games are represented on chain. We've seen already with Ethereum, like, okay, you have a token, right? And it's very easy to define a token. Anyone can define their own token standard, but coalescing around a single token standard enables things like Uniswap and things to start to exist. So people can make some some assumptions about like the foundations that they're building on, and you can start building, like the next order infrastructure and tooling and ecosystems that start to exist around that. And so once you can make that assumption about like the base layer conforming to some specification, which is ultimately what, Mud and Dojo are relatively simple at the end of the day from a smart contract perspective. They basically deal with the state of the world, the logic of the world, and the access control of like who can interact with it, like primarily around like who can write to the state of the world. And they're not like massive innovations. They rest on the work of a lot of people in the traditional gaming ecosystem, a lot of ideas that have been incorporated into it. But we decided to do this because it's a massive unlock for other people building in the Starknet ecosystem. So game developers can focus on building the things that make, like the hard part, which is the actual games that are fun and people want to play, and spend less time trying to build their own indexer, trying to build their own framework, trying to figure out like what should this smart contract architecture be to enable like extensibility and composability. Don't have to worry about like, oh, we need to audit this now and stuff like that. Like all of those things you get kind of out of the box with these frameworks, and you can focus on the things that matter most for the project that you're building.
Yeah, I think for us, it was mostly out of like, we just kept trying to make games and it was really hard. So it was really hard. And so I remember, so in Dark Forest, we wanted to add spaceships. And the PR to add spaceships was 10,000 lines of code because you had to like literally change the whole stack end to end to like add that one new thing. And surprisingly, that was not the straw that brought the camel back. We like did it again. We built a new game called ZK Dungeon, then became Ember. It was, if you guys are familiar with like this game called Dungeon Keeper, it was like an on-chain Dungeon Keeper. And at some point, we wanted to iterate on the game design because we found some flaws, and it was just, we were so demotivated to even do it because it was really hard to kind of like change that stuff end to end. And so we did some exploration into standardizing the data model, and out of that came the first version of Mud. We used it to build OPCraft, which was like a very simple version of Minecraft on chain. We did a residency where a bunch of people came to London and built games on top of that, and kind of like it took off from there. So yeah, for us, we just thought it was annoying and we wanted to make it easier. And then you get nerd sniped, and that's always the danger. It's like you shouldn't build the crazy complicated thing. You really need to like deliver value to users, and we can see it even for us. Like we built Mud 1 in 3 months, and then people started using it. And when we did our Christmas break and we came back, we had a bunch of ideas on how to make Mud 2 in a way that was way more generalizable. We thought it would take us 3 months again, and it has been a year, and it's finally being finished. Like the audit is being wrapped up, and we're like stabilizing things. So you got to be careful with falling too much into the nerd snipe and not doing stuff that is useful.
What's sort of the asymptotic pattern of usage for these frameworks, right? So let's say I build on-chain games, right? The way that I think about it is that the game itself, it's sort of like chess. Nobody really has ownership of the game, and then anybody's free to come along and build like a chess.com, offer bots that you can play against, offer coaching, like whatever, right? That's permissionless. That's done by basically users. So let's say that I'm using a game engine. You're always paying a certain overhead of using a general framework, right? When you're building a game, and ultimately, if you're trying to build something as permanent as, say, chess, or maybe even more permanent than chess, at some point, you don't want to spend that overhead anymore, right? So, like, what sort of pattern do you see developers using these game engines with, basically, and how does that play into the network effects? Because the network effect that we're talking about over here is that it's the ease of development, ease of developing on-chain games, right? Anybody can come in and plug into Mud and plug into Dojo. If I want to build on Starknet, I'll plug into Dojo. If I want to build on an EVM chain, I'll plug into Mud, and I can launch my mechanics very quickly, right? What's the sort of long-term story there?
So I think, for Dojo, and I think Mud in particular too, like they're pretty close to zero cost abstractions. Like I think, actually I know that you guys, depending on how you configure your state model, can more efficiently store state on chain. And with Dojo, we do something similar where we do like automatic bit packing and stuff, like stuff that you would have to typically do manually. I definitely appreciate the fact that frameworks built incorrectly can add a lot of overhead. I think like one of the unlocks of layer 2s, and if you really want to put a fully on-chain game, like build a fully on-chain game, it's gonna be complex. So we have to kind of make the assumption that there's gonna be a lot of compute available, and you're willing to take on some like marginal overhead in order to have like better abstractions that allows you to do like more interesting things fully on-chain. Dojo itself is when we created Dojo, we created it as an open source, like public good infrastructure contribution to the ecosystem because